Our next speaker today, you've met her once already. She is the president of Parking Australia. And if you think I'm a hard woman, you have not had a sit-down conversation with Cristina Lynn. Would you please make her very welcome?
I'm leaving Hillary behind the curtain this time. She's in the naughty corner. Thank you for allowing me to come and speak to you again. The topic of my presentation is future trends in parking occupancy, and I will be referring throughout the presentation to research that's available online and through various channels, but also through a number of submissions that we've received through some research that we've been carrying out and trying to engage as much as possible with the parking world in Australia and internationally, just to give you some flavour of some trends. By no means they're statistical, so they shouldn't be considered as being in any way representative of the entire population, but just to make a little bit of thought-provoking discussion. So while we're thinking about parking, I think it's important to understand that different people and different organisations look at parking in a little bit of a different way. Sometimes the same parking can be seen in different eyes, and maybe different parking areas or different businesses have a totally different outlook. So perspective is important when we're analysing the parking world. Is it a source of revenue? Often yes, but not necessarily so. Is it a neglected facility? Sometimes, but hopefully as time goes by, that's going to continue to improve. Or is it an integrated part of the customer's journey? And as such, a source of competitive advantage. And I guess how we are going through the presentation and understanding or trying to summarise what the key trends are, what are the threats to our industry and opportunities, and therefore how we can position our businesses to achieve some competitive advantage. A lot has been said about what the future of transport and the future of parking looks like, and I think if there's one thing that we can all agree on is that it's not going to be the same for every place and for every country and for every city. It's going to change, depend very much on a number of aspects which aren't necessarily tied to parking, but putting parking as part of the overall transport solution. So we have very progressive cities where parking or driving is on the naughty corner with Hillary, and going to be eradicated completely. And as you can see, Helsinki and Hamburg have that kind of plan in place, and I'm sure that they will achieve it, but it's not going to be the same everywhere. These are a couple of photos of the town in Sicily where my father comes from and where I spend a lot of time. And my conversations with people in that place is that they don't even like automatic cars. So driverless cars probably have Buckley's chance of coming in anytime soon. And what you can see there is something that happens 4 times a day, every day. One, when people go to work or shops, when people go home for lunch, when people go back to work after their siesta, and then at 7 o'clock when everybody goes home again. So we don't have 2 peaks, we have 4 peaks. So generalising about what parking is going to look like in the future, it's a little bit difficult when you have that kind of different outlook from the more advanced and transit-rich cities to other cities where the car is still king. It's undeniable, however, that how people travel is changing, and it's changing because of a lot of influences, whether it's social trends, technology, availability of public transport, environmental concerns, and of course how government policy reacts or behaves in facilitating some of that change. When it comes to relationship with cars, you can find statistics pretty much that will support any kind of point of view or the way that you think about what that's going to look like in the future. it is true that the percentage of people with cars in households is decreasing in some of the transit-rich cities like San Francisco, London and New York. However, Australian cities are not quite at that point yet, and in fact the car fleet in Australia grew by 2.1% between 2015 and 2016. So the dependence on cars in our own society is still increasing. Similarly, there's a lot of talk about the younger generations not driving, not getting their driving licenses, not buying cars. That could have something to do with driverless vehicles, but also it has to do with, for example, the fact that to now get a driving license, your kid has to spend, or well, you have to spend 150 hours or some ridiculous number of time aiding your child, your young person in the family. And if you've got more than one kid, I don't know what you do. Whereas I remember when I got my license, and I won't tell you how many decades that was ago, but you just went, did the exam, and basically you got your P's and off you went. So there is a lot of things that are actually influencing how people are thinking about getting a car, but I think the important thing is that young people are in a position where they can make different decisions about what method of transport they're going to use depending on what they're doing. So they're not going to be using the same method every day or at different times of the day or for the same purpose. So that's an important consideration. The percentage of people driving to work is also changing. On the left there you will see some statistics about some of the US cities with transit-rich environments where the percentage of people driving to work is decreasing. But on the right, you will see that the percentage of people driving to work in Australian cities between 2001 and 2011 hasn't really gone that much. So again, there's a little bit of a different approach or a different outcome depending on where you live and what kind of public transport or what other options you have to get to work. This is an interesting one on cycling. So how is cycling impacting on how people are, what the relationship of people with their motor vehicle? If you look on the left graph and on the left side of the left graph, you will see that in the developed world where there's already a high uptake of cycling, the projections over the next 20 or so years, business as usual, so without actually going crazy in terms of bicycle lanes and other types of technology, is actually increasing. But on the right-hand side of that left chart, you look at developing countries, and actually they're doing the opposite. They've been riding bicycles for decades, and they're now wanting to get into their cars. So that use of the cycles, again, is different between different parts of the world. And on the right side, you will see some information about Australian cities. The cycling to work is increasing, but it's actually at a very low level of uptake at the moment. So before cycling becomes a significant component of the transport solution, I think there's going to have to be a lot of time. Staying with the bicycles though, from a tenant point of view and understanding what tenants are looking for in terms of retaining staff, cycling is an important component of the offer. Collier's was putting out some interesting statistics that I haven't been able to find, more recent ones in 2012, but there's a clear indication that there is a trend in the decrease of providing parking for their employees, and a clear indication that cycling and end-of-trip facilities are actually on the up, and it's becoming almost one of those things like the green and red lights in the shopping centre car parks, that you must have a good level of end-of-trip facilities for your staff to retain and gain that employment. Another aspect of changing trends, and I won't go into detail of that because I think we've talked about it and you'll be able to look at it out there, is the availability of information and how people are making decisions about how they travel, what they use to get to work, and how they interact with those various transport options. The choices are becoming quite endless. And again, I'm not going to talk about driverless vehicles. There's people more qualified than me on that topic. I think it's important to consider that in the near future, Uber may be taking away more from taxis than from actual parking. And the thought that Uber will become ubiquitous in terms of public transport, I think we need to understand that although, or despite of automation, putting people from a huge bus or a train into a small automated vehicle is actually going to potentially have a big impact on congestion. So the availability of road space is going to determine how much Uber is, or the driverless vehicle with a sharing opportunity, going to actually affect the way that people are going to be able to get around on the roads before everything gets totally congested. One of my, or it's not my idea only, but I think one of the important things that we need to consider is that the space on the street itself is actually quite limited, and the opportunity cost that we allocate to parking on street and on at-grade areas is quite high, and therefore, is that the best use of that space, considering that we have all these other potential uses of transport, being cycling and driverless vehicles and light rails and all those kinds of things coming up. And therefore, the repurposing of at-grade car parks is something that could be quite interesting in the decision of where parking actually should be allocated. We use that quite a lot in the work that we do in terms of the pyramid of, or the hierarchy of the parking or the street space, and how you actually use that space most effectively. And the highest use is obviously that to allow the streets to be free for public transport, and the least useful at the bottom of the pyramid is allowing commuters to park on street all day and clogging up the streets. So therefore, the thought of using streets for what they're intended is for moving vehicles rather than parking is potentially something that could be considered. And there was some interesting analytics there that if you actually took away cars parked on both sides of the road, you actually would get 20% more available space. And I think we all suffer that unfortunate situation often when you're driving along a 3-lane road and you actually have a car parked on the curb of the lane nearest to the curb, and therefore that immediately halves or reduces the amount of space that you have to actually drive by a significant proportion. So the 1 or 2 cars that are left parked on the roadside are actually a big influencer on how quickly people can get around. Just to give you an example of a good story in terms of repurposing at-grade car park into a public space is this Jubilee Square in Leicester in the UK. That was a 50-space car park that generated around £200,000 a year in revenue. Huge community backlash when the idea of that not being, no longer being a car park, in terms of the fact that they had to move a bus stop, there was a tree that had to be chopped back, and the fact that there wasn't enough parking in that town, whereas in fact it was actually found through research and communication with the community that there was a lot of available car spaces that weren't used all the time. The project was £4 million, and it was co-funded by the European Regional Development Fund, which I guess for the UK that's not going to be any longer an option. But the conversion is now achieved such positive feedback that the mayor is actually very excited about having done that. So the way that you actually negotiate through some of these changes as a local government entity is important, but if we're working in the right direction and achieving the right outcomes, then it's probably worth going into bat for that. And I'm just giving you another example there from South America, in Bogota in Colombia, where a fairly small and inefficient and fairly ugly car park was converted into an interesting public space for people to play. Don't ask me how people get across the road or whether that's a dangerous thing, because I'm not quite sure. And that's, I guess, one of the things you need to think about is how does that actually fit into the overall streetscape. And I guess we all know what Times Square used to look like and what it looks like now. So there's a lot of happy, successful stories in terms of repurposing on-street parking to other better users. Here's a little bit of feedback on the research that we carried out. And I've split it between Australia and the rest of the world just to show a little bit of different approaches and different trends. So we asked, what kind of impact on your demand have you experienced over the last 5 years? Whereas in Australia, it was fairly even between decrease and increase. Overseas, there was a significant trend towards the fact that parking demand had increased in the last 5 years. But when you look at what they said when we asked about what do you think that's going to look like in the future 5 years, the rest of the world basically had a fairly even outlook in terms of increase and decrease of parking demand, whereas in Australia we're still very optimistic, although the percentage increase is actually quite small. So we're expecting a fairly flat level of demand change for parking over the next 5 years. So some of the threats in terms of the business of parking: the fact that stagnant prices and demand, the congestion levies, and the low level of change, innovation, and differentiation between different parking structures. In terms of pricing, there hasn't really been any significant uplift. In fact, they've hardly kept pace with inflation. I'm just showing you there, and the slides will be available afterwards, but just the trends on the 2-hour parking average prices for Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane are fairly low, with around no more than 2%, but mostly around the 1% mark movement since 2014. And that's the early bird pricing. And as you can see, for example, in Brisbane, as soon as a significant demand or supply of parking actually gets put into the market, what effect that might have on the early bird pricing, which is the most sensitive one for people driving to work and deciding whether they're going to take their car or public transport. Whereas, as we know, parking congestion levies are probably here to stay and continue to increase until the state government thinks of something a bit more effective in terms of how we're going to stop congestion when the money is already so easily available. And it may be possible, hopefully not, but there may be some other new places entering into the parking levy calculation. On the operational side, the fact that there's not really huge amounts of change or innovation, or there haven't been to position car parks effectively for the future, is an area of risk. Low level of investment in a property will have a significant negative effect on service over time. Sometimes operational costs are being kept low for particular reasons, and that has an impact over a period of time over the frequency of use of a car park, so that's an important thing to consider. And again, going back to the original slides, if you think about a car park as just a facility and not a source of competitive advantage, that also has some negative implications. From an opportunities point of view, there is growth in demand in Australian CBDs. The supply is going to continue to become more limited because new developments are having less and less parking being supplied with them. And what can be done about repurposing of car parks? There's a lot of talk about, well, we won't need those car parks, but my question is, what are we actually going to do with, particularly with underground car parks? There's not really a huge number of things that you can do with those assets. So workforces are expected to increase pretty much around Australia, and as is the residential growth. There's a lot of redevelopment of old commercial buildings in Sydney and Melbourne that are being converted to to residential and new commercial buildings being developed. Everyone's talking about the fact of how many cranes are in the skyline of our cities, or at least some of them. And the resurgence of CBD retail is also another component that's actually indicating that more and more people will be attending our CBDs. And as I said before, because of a number of factors, including changes to government policy and owners not taking up as much parking, and the development of public transport means that supply is actually going to become more constrained going forward. Another question that we asked in our research was, what have you actually seen happening, or what have you actually adopted as potential opportunities for repurposing car parks? And I've split that into commercial buildings in this slide and the other types in the following slides. And the answers are pretty much the same between Australia and the rest of the countries, although some of the amount of redevelopment in changes according to what it is. So bicycle parking in Australia is one of the most common uses of repurposing car spaces in commercial buildings, followed by storage, commercial car sharing services, and gym and well-being facilities, which I think that's going to be continuing to increase going forward. Similar outcomes in retail, with repurposing of some parking to retail depending on the location. We now see a lot of the redevelopment of ground level potential parking, or previously used as parking, as becoming used for retail because of the fact that it's actually accessible to customers along the street frontage. And with mixed-use developments, pretty much the same thing, but there hasn't really been any demonstrable use of parking structures in any commercially viable way that we can actually say, well, that's a good thing we could do with our car parks, this blah, blah. Well, I'm not quite sure what that actually, what that looks like. We do see the use of car parks in other uses, but it's usually a bit of a gimmicky thing, or just let's do something different and let's go and do a fashion show in a grungy environment, but they're not really commercially sustainable ideas to actually consider that for a permanent type of repurposing. So what are the implications for the management of parking in the foreseeable future? Some current results and how we differentiate the car parking supply, and what do we do from an operational point of view. I guess my conclusion is that car parks will continue to be used for parking cars in the foreseeable future, but the important thing is, are we prepared for that change, and how are we going to address it? Interestingly, I think the presentation beforehand, and we couldn't have done it better if we'd actually sat down and discussed what everyone's going to talk about, but a lot of the stuff that was discussed by the previous panel actually answers a lot of the research analysis that we've found, that the important thing in going forward is understanding how you run your business and how you actually make that business more efficient. Reviewing parking prices, for example, is one of the more common activities that a car park operator or owner would want to be doing. Identifying special products or additional products, packaging the type of parking supply or uses at different times of the day or the evening, and reactivating times when the car park is not being used as much by creating innovative products. Another important one is reducing operating costs without incurring lack of delivery of customer service. Identifying alternative sales channels, pretty much the digital media type disruptors. looking at what the competitors are doing and making sure that we are staying in par with what's going on. As Chrissy said, the parking guidance systems a few years ago were a nice thing to have, or a bit of an innovation. Now it's become expected. So if you're providing that kind of level of service, is actually just keeping up with what's going on in the surrounding area, and to get ahead of that curve and think about the next new way of improving your service is clearly very important. So how do we go from a cost leadership, traditional way of looking at the business of parking, and with the aim of becoming fully differentiated, but understanding that sometimes that's quite expensive, and depending on whether your car park has a revenue, creates a source of revenue, or it's just a service to the customers, you may not necessarily achieve that high level of differentiation that you're looking for, but clearly moving towards an integrated analysis that allows you to get the maximum benefit for the lowest possible cost. The reality is that a lot of car parks pretty much look the same. I think about sometimes the way that car parks are thought of as being out of sight, out of mind, but we have said already a number of times, and we will continue to hear that the car park is your first point of contact very often with your customers, and therefore if you're spending all that money on your foyers and fresh flowers and all the rest of it, and your managing director gets into the car park and gets in the lift and goes straight to the top floor and never has an interaction with the foyer, then really the car park becomes a point where you want to adopt that same level of service as throughout the building. So more and more we're looking at ways that we can create some kind of differentiation, and people are very affected by the visual impact, by the lighting, the sense of safety, especially if we're trying to draw drivers and cars from the road or from the street level into the underground. That underground needs to be a pleasant place to be, a safe place to be. The experience is very important. That picture on the top left there is of an end-of-trip facility in a building in Melbourne. And I've visited already a number of other buildings around Australia where the end-of-trip facilities feel like you're in some kind of fancy spa in Bali or something, and you wonder how people actually get out of those things and go to work. So the experience part of that service is important. The ability to have recharge for your electric vehicles, and we know now that parking guidance, for example, is pretty much a basic point of entry. So we are seeing a lot of refurbishments happening, and car parks that are being spruced up and being differentiated by some way. And I think that's going to be quite well demonstrated during the award ceremonies tomorrow, how much emphasis is being paid now into the beautification of car parks. Being able to have different payment options and facilitating the speed at which people get in and out is also another important source of differentiation. And from an operational point of view, it's how we approach the current business and how we make sure that if we've got untapped potential from a revenue point of view, or from improving the operational costs to achieve a level of differentiation that in turn then we can use to justify an increase in revenues or prices, and find those areas where we may have the ability to make those small increases that actually could have a significant impact on car park revenues going forward. I think that's things that we need to think about as an industry. Benchmarking, maximizing technology, reviewing the operating model, and having a well-funded and resourced team, whether it's internal or external. Just last couple of slides before I conclude. What's happening around other cities? I think an important thing that we need to probably think a little bit more carefully, or devote a lot of time in Australia, in Australian cities, is we don't actually really know how many parking spaces we have. It's one of those mysterious statistics that we find very difficult when we get involved, especially with local government projects, where we actually go and try and develop a parking strategy, and the actual number of real parking spaces in a particular town or municipality is almost as difficult as finding out how many people work in a hospital, which is one of those other mysterious statistics. So understanding and creating a system how we can actually identify those parking spaces and whether they're actually utilized and to what level and at what times of the day would help in understanding how we can then find a solution in terms of the off-street versus the on-street and the conflicting uses of the roads for public transport and cycling and for loading zones and disabled parking and so on, and try and bring as many cars into the existing underground car parks. And cities like San Francisco have been doing that kind of research, and they actually realize that more than 50% of 441,000 spaces are on the street. So if you know that information, then you can actually start implementing strategies of how you're going to manage those spaces, and then what are you actually going to plan to do as demand for parking decreases? Where is the best place to actually locate that parking? And what are you going to do with the other freed up resources? Similarly, in Philadelphia, they have a system of conducting a parking census every 5 years, and they've been doing that since 1990. And as we heard the panel before, information is king. If you don't have that level of information, how can you actually make decisions that are going to be viable and sustainable over time? So you've got to start with actually knowing what that bank, that supply of parking assets are in your location, and how you can actually achieve the highest level of earning or customer service for those spaces. And there's just a few other statistics about what's going on in other parts of the world and how the supply of public transport and the efficiency of the public transport actually then becomes part of the decision for what the regulations and what the government are going to do about allowing you to have parking in your new developments. So just to conclude, I think the important thing, the outcome of the research that we've done is that the demand for parking is not going to necessarily be increasing significantly over time, but the learning is that we really need to understand how much supply we actually have, how is it delivered, is it public, is it private, how can the public and the private work together to actually make sure that existing parking supply is fully utilized for the benefit of the local community, and then how you could actually adapt other on-street or at-grade parking supply to more livable spaces and to improving the sense of community and the sense of place in our cities. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.